Hello, my name is Mike Dawes and I would like to introduce you to my 1937 Frazer Nash BMW 326. BMW started in 1916 as an aircraft engine manufacturer in Munich. They did quite well in the First War. It kept on going throughout the 20s, but realized that the motor car was really a direction to go. And they acquired a company called Dixie, who had themselves acquired a license to build Austin 7s. And from there, the BMW marque gradually evolved to the point where in about 1935, they were ready to be playing big time. Up to then, it had been a rather small company with a bit of a niche market of sporting, interesting little cars. But now they were looking to go larger. And this was at the time when the autobahns were starting to appear in Germany. Changes in taxation was really encouraging the Germans to be building cars of the finest caliber. As part of the rebuilding of Germany in the 30s, the construction of autobahns throughout the country had several significant benefits. One which people didn't really want to address at the time was that if you've got autobahns radiating throughout the country, that means troop movements can be made a lot easier. But it also meant that it was creating jobs, which were desperately needed. It was creating opportunities for fast transport. And in 1935, Hitler changed the taxation structure for motor vehicles in Germany to remove previous restrictions similar to what we had to endure in this country up to 1947. And so by removing those restrictions was actually creating opportunities for designers to be building cars fit for purpose rather than to be worrying about building cars to be saving taxation and expense for the customers. Long and the short of it, BMW were there at the right place at the right time with the 326 to be building a long-distance Autobahn cruiser. Germany was going places and they were going to be going fast. BMW was at the vanguard of all of this. And that was actually quite clear in the early post-war period when BMW were trying to do anything that they could to survive. BMW, by the mid-30s, held the world altitude records for piston engines. They were well on their way to developing jet engines for aviation use. They had built the R5 motorcycle, which arguably was the finest touring motorcycle available pre-war. They had built what in their view was the finest of touring cars. They'd gone head to head with Mercedes and beaten them hands down with the 326. A few months later, they produced the 328, which was the sports car which would beat just about anything and would go on to win the 1940 Mille Miglia, regardless of engine capacity. These were the vehicles to have. There are photographs of Hitler in conversation with Herr Popp, the CEO of BMW, quite happily chatting with each other at the 36 Berlin Motor Show. This I don't regard as a disgrace for BMW. Popp was distinctly non-political, and so the plan evolved to build a 2-litre straight-six engined saloon which would be capable of transporting 5 people at up to 75 miles an hour over great distances. And so that's being the concept for what we now know as the 326. It was launched at the Berlin Motor Show early 36, where it became the star vehicle. And eventually some 16,000 were built. It was the largest volume car that BMW made prior to the war, and in fact it carried on post-war under the communist regime known as the EMW, Eisenach rather than Bavarian, so EMW 340. Another 20-odd thousand were made post-war. So the structure was sound. It was more production than many of the cars of its time. And why was that? It was a combination of a lot of quality features, a very substantial box frame to which was welded pressed steel bodywork made by Ambibud in Berlin. Ambibud having got great experience in earlier years from pressed steel bodywork in America, their European plant was turning out massive amounts of bodywork for a number of manufacturers. They knew how to construct a lightweight, strong, rugged vehicle. And in fact, by the way, mine only weighs just over 20 hundredweight, which for a car of its size is quite significantly light. The heart of the car is always the engine, and in this case, it followed BMW's principles of 6 cylinders, an inline 6 conventional push rod with a single side camshaft. It was 2 litre or 1971cc to be precise, designed to be producing in standard form 50 bhp. That doesn't sound a lot, but the whole point was that this would be an unburstable car. A top speed of some 75 miles an hour, the idea being that you'd be able to cruise it all day at 72 miles an hour. That left plenty of margin for design, development and improvement. The package overall proved to be very successful. As I mentioned, some 16,000 were produced, marketed in a number of countries throughout the world. Frazer Nash had existed since the 1920s as constructors of chain-driven cars for people whose main interest in motoring was motorsport. Whether it's racing, trials, rallying, whatever. That was the whole reason for having a Frazer Nash. But by the mid-30s, that market was beginning to decline somewhat. One of the events that Frazer Nash supported each year was the Alpine Rally. In 1934, they found themselves soundly beaten by the BMW sports cars. The Aldington brothers, who'd owned Frazer Nash since about 1928, and decided if you can't beat them, join them. So later in the year, they wrote to BMW to say, we would like to build your cars under license here in England. BMW responded in a very positive manner. The Aldingtons went out there and concluded a deal whereby, although they couldn't manufacture in this country, they would be the sole importers of BMWs into the UK. They would be branded as Frazer Nash BMW, and they would all come in right-hand drive. Some cars would be delivered in chassis form, others as complete vehicle. That commenced in 34, and the factory in London Road, Isleworth, was still carried on producing chain drive Frazer Nashes for a small while. A separate larger building was built next door to accommodate the BMWs. When the 326 turned up, that must have been a bit of a shock, because mostly the clientele were interested in small, lightweight, highly competitive sports cars. To have a large saloon not producing a great horsepower, this must have been a bit strange. And I sometimes wonder who exactly were buying these cars, particularly as the model first arrived in the UK in very early 37, and relationships were already starting to get a bit uncomfortable with Germany, but at least 60 cars, 60 of my model did find a market over here, and a lot more of the 328 sports car, the 327 Grand Touring car as well. Onto my car in particular, mine was manufactured in February 37 and shipped over to England almost as soon as it was made, delivered to Frazer Nash, or AFN as the company was known, in Isleworth, 8th of February 37. I don't know exactly when it was sold to its first owner, probably within a few days, because it was back at the factory in March 37 for its first service. It must have given its owner a lot of satisfaction because it had done over 14,000 miles by March 38. By March 39, it was 29,000 miles. And when it changed hands after the war in 48, it had done nearly 40,000 miles. So whoever owned it certainly had an awful lot of use out of the car. But clearly it got looked after well, because even in the 1948 report for a person who was buying it at that time, it was described as a very good car for its year. My particular car, regrettably, we do not have the full history on it. It was some 20 years back acquired by a BMW dealer in the Midlands and restored. And why is it so important? Apart from being a quality car of the period, it's what it also became later. Now, the Bristol Motor Company didn't exist pre-war, but the Bristol Aircraft Factory had existed for a great many years, and Bristol producing aircraft engines would have certainly known BMW, who were also producing aircraft engines. The two of them would clearly have had affinity with each other. The published story is that the Aldington brothers, who owned Frazer Nash, hot-footed over to Germany as quickly as they could after the Nazi regime had collapsed in 45, to pull out of Germany as much as they could in terms of important people, important cars, drawings, anything which would be useful for post-war production. They got into bed with the guys down at Filton, who had been since 1942 thinking about wanting to be making cars themselves post-war. And it's interesting to speculate on just how much Bristol may have been focusing on BMW as a target long before the Aldingtons got into conversation with them. Long and the short of it is that quite rapidly a 326 chassis would have appeared at Bristol, and they would clearly look at it very closely. And the outcome in 1946 was a car up and running known as the 400. The choice of number is interesting, because in BMW parlance, 1 was engines, 2 was motorcycles, 3 was the car division, which is why my number of my cars started with a 3. We get the next car coming along, which isn't anything to do with BMW, starts with a 4, Bristol 400. As a fascinating aside, when BMW finally get round to producing cars several years later, they start with the 5. The 501 is the first post-war BMW car. So you can see that there's a lot of linkage between the two. So, the Bristol 400, what is it? The prototype, which I've had the pleasure to drive, and if one sees the November 2018 issue of Classic and Sports Car magazine, one will see a comparison between my 326 and the prototype 400. When Michael, the owner of the 400, got out of my car on the banking here at Brooklands, and I got out of his car, we almost said to each other in unison, they're the same. And they did feel the same. It was an extraordinary experience. I've never got into anybody else's car and felt so at home in it, and I'd never driven a Bristol before. Why are they so similar? Because they have the same chassis. The running gear is all the same, except that Bristol really did a pick and mix of BMW's greatest hits. They took the chassis of the 326, the engine of the 328, which had started as 326, and the body was an English design based on the BMW 327 Coupe. It's probably closer to a BMW than to a Bristol, but on the outside it is clearly recognisable as a Bristol.
The more you look at it, the more styling cues you'll see. And putting the two side by side is absolutely fascinating for anybody interested in either BMW or Bristol, or in my case both. It's a joy to behold. It really is compare and contrast. The Bristol became the star of the 47 Geneva Motor Show, and from there it went into production. The model started to evolve, moving slightly away from BMW components. BMW having been built for large-scale production, that wasn't quite feasible in Bristol's case. So the wonderfully complex lever arm front shock absorbers, which are double acting and, to be honest, rather expensive to make or restore, those in due course were replaced with telescopic shock absorbers and a similar arrangement at the back. But other than that, the general arrangement persisted. And that chassis ran through to, I believe, 1961. There are arguments that the influence stayed on considerably longer, but suffice it to say virtually every Bristol since has had the same wheelbase. Bristol continued to develop the engine themselves in various stages and stretched it out to 2.2 litre. It became apparent that this was an engine which was going to be rather useful for a lot more people than just Bristol themselves. AC, who were making cars not very far from here at Brooklands, decided that as their own six-cylinder engine from 1919 was getting pretty tired by the mid-50s, and couldn't really go much above 120, 130 bhp, certainly not with the technology available at that time. To switch to Bristol was a pretty obvious choice for them. And so the AC Ace appeared in Bristol form to make an extremely competitive car. Other companies took interest. For example, Cooper at Surbiton. They found that an ideal engine to be installing into their cars, and so create a Grand Prix car. Other companies rejoiced in the power of the engine, which could be producing some 180 brake horsepower with reliability, over 3 times as much as what my car was producing, which just goes to show that BMW pretty much got it right in 1936. So starting at the front end, we have a 2 litre straight 6, which became the mainstay of BMW production for a good number of years. My one has got twin SU carburetors, which, although not correct for period, would have been available at that time. The car is comprehensively kitted out with a full complement of tools, including a neatly displayed tool case, it was made in Germany, and in particular the body was made by Ambibud, who were specialists in pressed steel bodywork in Johannesthal, Berlin. What happened was that the bodies were made in Berlin, shipped across to Eisenach, where the whole car was put together, before being brought to Isleworth in Middlesex, where it was then distributed in the UK market. And because it was to be marketed in the UK, that is why it's known as a Frazer Nash BMW. So let me introduce you to the interior of the car. All of the cars imported into the UK came in right-hand drive, with instruments converted to imperial measurement. I mentioned it being extremely well kitted out, and one of the features I find particularly attractive
is that we have a steering lock, which for 1937 was quite an advanced feature. We also have the delight of being able to open the windows to give either ventilation in the summer or to help demist during the winter. It has a 4-speed gearbox, and in best European fashion, a very long lever, quite contrary to how it was being done in the UK at the time. We have a delightful amount of space in the back for up to 3 passengers. And in this car, the arrangement was that one accessed the commodious boot from the back seat. Enough luggage space for up to 5 people for a decent holiday. Now, the reason why we access the luggage from the boot is because of the spare wheel on the back, and in particular the access to the fuel tank. BMW made sure that everything was locking and safe. Here we have a lock for the cap, which gives us the fuel tank and access to the spare wheel. So locking petrol cap, that's, I think, quite an advanced feature of its time. So all in all, it is a very fast, comfortable, long distance tourer with plenty of space for the driver and up to 4 passengers. Change and synchro on 3rd and 4th. Delightful cruising car. I tend to find she's comfortable between 50 and 60, and on a motorway, if we're in a bit of a rush, 70 isn't a great problem. The car was designed to be cruising at about 70 or so, with a maximum top speed of about 75. The idea being that one could cover long distances effortlessly without putting too much strain on the car. For our part, we find something like about 200 mile is as much as one would want to do without taking a break. Sadly, the track gets worse every year, but at least we've still got cars to play in. I don't know if this car ever came to Brooklands. Certainly the person who bought it in 1937 would have had interest in having a car of some quality there was a good number of Frazer Nashes and Frazer Nash BMWs competing during the interwar period.